King Gustav Vasa is one of Sweden's most important monarchs, and in this two-part series we will cover his wars against Denmark, as well as how his reign laid the foundation for the Swedish Empire. The three Scandinavian kingdoms, Sweden, Norway and Denmark, had ever since the late 14th century been part of a political union known as the Kalmar Union. The original idea behind the union was that the three kingdoms would be united under one king, yet retain their own laws and customs. This way, the union was intended to ensure peace between the three kingdoms, as well as protection from outside forces. From its inception, however, the union was plagued by conflict, especially between Denmark and Sweden. Several kings, most of whom were Danes, were accused of levying unjust taxes on the Swedish peasantry, as well as dragging Sweden into wars of aggression without the consent of the Swedish Rikscouncil. The tensions led to many peasant uprisings occurring in Sweden throughout the 15th century that often were supported by Swedish noblemen who took advantage of the unrest to improve their political positions. In the mid-15th century, a nobleman called Karl Knutsson Bonde declared himself to be the king of Sweden, with support from large sections of the land's clergy and nobility. Despite bloody conflicts with the Danish crown, he managed to hold on to the title until his death in 1470, and even after his death, the kings of Denmark were not accepted as the rulers of Sweden. Though the union remained in some sense, the Swedish throne was empty, and would remain empty until the early 16th century. Instead, Sweden was governed by the Rikscouncil, a governmental body consisting of Sweden's bishops and members of its high nobility. At the turn of the 16th century, the council was divided into two factions, known as the Unionists, who wanted the council to swear allegiance to the crown of Denmark, and the Separatists, who wanted Sweden to cut all ties to the Kalmar Union in favor of becoming an independent kingdom. In 1512, the leader of the Unionist faction, Erik Trolle, managed to become the leader of the council, giving the Unionists the upper hand and increasing the likelihood that the Danish monarchs once again would rule over Sweden. The election, however, was revoked by the leader of the Separatists, Sten Sture, who rallied the peasantry and enough of the nobility to his side, and forcefully removed Trolle from his position as the head of the council, and claimed the position for himself. Around the same time, a new king was crowned in Denmark, called Christian II. Witnessing the political intrigues that were happening in Sweden, as well as his predecessors' inability to regain control of the country, he realized that he would never gain the Swedish crown through diplomatic means. Between 1517 and 1520, Christian launched several invasion attempts against Sweden, most of whom were pushed back by the Separatists' forces. In 1520, however, Sten Sture, the leader of the Separatists, died in battle, leaving the Separatists disorganized and leaderless. This made them unable to mount an effective defense, and the Danish king soon laid siege to Stockholm. Realizing that he wouldn't be able to storm the city, Christian decided to pardon the Separatists in exchange for their surrender. The Separatist leaders agreed, and Christian was crowned King of Sweden soon after. A feast was arranged, which lasted for 3 days at Stockholm Castle, attended by Unionists and former Separatists alike. Unfortunately for the Separatists, the Danish king would soon reveal his true intentions regarding their pardon. In the middle of the third night, the doors of Stockholm Castle were shut, and the former Separatists were arrested by the king's soldiers. What had been a celebration turned into a trial, as the Danish kings, as well as Swedish Unionists, launched accusations against their former enemies. When the trial was over, King Christian sentenced all of the separatists' leaders to death. On a cold November day, most members of the old council were beheaded at the main square in Stockholm. The executed included bishops, noblemen, servants, administrators, as well as the mayor of Stockholm. In total, around 80 to 100 people were killed, most through beheading, and the streets ran red with blood. The punishment would not end there, however. Since some of the Unionists were leading members of the Catholic Church in Sweden, like bishops and archbishops, the separatists were declared to be heretics, and once they'd been executed, their bodies were torn apart and burnt in 3 large bonfires. In fact, the Unionists went so far as to dig up the body of the late separatist leader Sten Sture and burnt it with the rest. When the smoke had settled, King Christian's rule over Sweden, and thus Scandinavia as a whole, seemed to be unchallenged. Most of the separatist leaders were dead, and those that remained were disorganized, and without the power to pose a serious challenge to the crown of Denmark. This, however, would not be the end of the story. From the ashes of the bonfire, a new land would rise. The Middle Ages were coming to an end, and a new era dawned on the horizon. Following the executions of the separatists, the Danish king traveled what's called Eriksgatan, roughly translated as Eric's Road. According to tradition, the kings of Sweden, upon their coronation, are obliged to journey through the realm's most important regions to have their crown accepted by the region's elders, thus acknowledging them as the true kings of the Swedes. Christian's journey, however, would be quite different from those of former kings. In most places he arrived, he executed influential noblemen and clergy who had been former separatists, causing bad blood and civil unrest among the people he visited. It wasn't long before peasant uprisings broke out. The uprisings were partially a reaction to the harsh actions of Christian, but also to new taxes the king imposed on the Swedish peasantry, as well as a campaign he had started to disarm the Swedish peasantry, which the peasants saw as violations against their ancient rights to protect themselves against unjust rulers. In several places, the rebels successfully fought back against King Christian's forces. One such rebellion in a northern region called Dalarna, roughly translated to the valleys, were led by a young nobleman who soon would come to be the central character in this story. Gustav Eriksson Vasa was born in 1496 and was a member of the Swedish high nobility. Not much is known of his early life, except that his family was part of the Swedish separatists. During a battle against Unionist forces in 1518, Gustav was taken prisoner and held captive in the Danish castle called Karlö. He managed to escape to the city of Lübeck in 1519, and then made his way back to Sweden in 1520. At the time of his arrival, the leader of the separatists, Sten Sture, had just died, and King Christian was besieging Stockholm. Not sure what to do, he decided to lay low at his family estate in Räffnäs, where he, in November 1520, received the news of the executions in Stockholm. Among the people who had lost their head was his father, Erik Johansson Vasa, who was the mayor of Stockholm, mentioned earlier, and if this wasn't bad enough, Gustav was also informed that the new king officially had confiscated all of his family's lands and estates, and that the Danes were searching for him. Unable to stay in Räffnes, Gustav decided to fight back, and to do so he journeyed north to Dalarna to rally the people to his cause. The people in the region were tough. More or less everyone had weapons, and they had a tradition of rising up in rebellion several times during the 15th century. Hearing the news that the Danes were planning to take their weapons, they agreed to take up arms and declared Gustav to be their leader. What started off as a band of a few dozen quickly grew into a force of several thousands, and though only consisting of armed peasants, the army still managed to defeat the Unionists' forces that were sent against them. One such victory was at Brunbäck River, where the peasants managed to defeat a Danish army roughly the same size, and afterwards, several noble families, as well as several important cities, defected to the rebels. A year into the war, Gustav managed to enter into an alliance with Lübeck, who provided the rebellion with loans, weapons, as well as naval support, allowing Gustav to rely less on the armed peasantry in favor of paid soldiers. Much of the Danes' problems in dealing with the rebels were caused by troubles the Danish king had gotten himself into during his campaigns to take the Swedish crown. In order to finance his campaigns between 1517 and 1520, Christian had taken loans from the Hanseatic trade cities, as well as introduced new taxes on the Danish peasantry. The Danish peasants, like their Swedish counterparts, were not happy with this, and the Hanseatic lenders were starting to put pressure on Christian to pay them back. In addition, had his brutal treatment of the Swedish separatists, several of whom were clergy, angered the Catholic Church officials in Denmark, as well as in Rome, and when the wars against the Swedes went bad, many of King Christian's supporters lost faith in him. In 1523, a rebellion broke out in Jylland that were led by Danish noblemen, which forced Christian to flee Denmark, with the Danish crown going to his uncle Frederick I. With Christian gone, and his successor unable to enforce his claim to the throne, the Swedish rebels successfully captured Stockholm in June 1523. On the 6th of June, Gustav Vasa marched into Stockholm, and as the leader of the rebellion, he was declared King of Sweden by the separatists soon after. The rebels' entry into Stockholm has traditionally been seen as a dividing line in Swedish history. The Middle Ages were over, and the early modern era dawned. All political ties to the Kalmar Union were severed, and Sweden became an independent realm. Gustav Vasa's story would not end here, however. The new kingdom was poor, and the state's finances were in shambles, and while the Danes had been driven out, there was still unrest among the peasantry. As the King of Sweden, Gustav had to deal with these issues, and during his long reign, which we will cover in part 2 of this series, he would transform the country down to its core. Today, I hope you learned something new about the history of Gustav Vasa. Thanks for watching.